We live in a lonely and anxious time. That's just the facts. I grew up thinking that loneliness was something that happened when you were older and people in your, you didn't have any family, people forgot about you. And I remember in the church that I grew up in, we would often visit what were called shut-ins. I don't think it's a very politically correct term for today, but it just meant, elderly people who had no one to visit. And that's how I kind of imagined loneliness. And then in college, at the school that I went to, we had a program at the Newman Center called Adopt a Grandparent. And I used to visit this gentleman named Jim Reap, who was a once famous forest ranger in Pennsylvania. He was now, at this time when I was visiting, blind, and he had no one to visit him. And I would secretly sneak in root beer and chewing tobacco, and I would hear his stories about life in the Pennsylvania woods and the coal mines. And most memorably, I remember his vision of the Virgin Mother once. So it was a really great experience. But this idea that loneliness is something that affects old people, elderly people, is not true. Something happened during my lifetime. Loneliness is no longer a crisis just for the elderly. Today, young people who are surrounded by their fellow high school and college students report record levels of loneliness and anxiety. Here's some quick statistics on this that are pretty amazing. Young adults are twice as likely to be lonely than seniors. Isn't that amazing? Young adults are twice as likely to be lonely than seniors. 79% of adults aged 18 to 24 report feeling lonely, compared to 41% of seniors aged 66 and older. And 36 reported severe loneliness, which meant they felt lonely frequently or almost all the time. But among the population, 61% of young people aged 18 to 25 reported being lonely. About half of the lonely young adults reported that no one in the past few weeks had taken more than just a few minutes to ask how they were doing in a way that made them feel like the person genuinely cared. 63% of young adults also suffer symptoms of anxiety and depression. So we have a real epidemic of loneliness and anxiety, and it's not an elder problem. It's a young person's problem. It's the next generation. It's people who you'd think has their whole life ahead of them and they should be carefree and happy, but they're stressed out and they're quite lonely. At Pepperdine School Public Policy last week, I spoke at a conference for the American Project, and I facilitated a panel on loneliness that inspired the sermon. Two of the leading psychologists on the subject were there, and the data they shared was some of the data that I've just read. It was quite alarming. They showed a real uptick in anxiety, depression, and loneliness. And Dr. Jean Twenge, who was speaking, noticed that this spike took place really in 2015 and continued up like a hockey stick. She showed that there doesn't seem to be any connection with economics with this. There was loneliness in bad economic times, and then there was loneliness in good economic times. It really wasn't related to economics. But the other trend that she did see was a dramatic decrease in informal gatherings among friends. So we have loneliness going way up, and we have anxiety going right with it. It's happening to all groups. It's highest among young women, interestingly enough. And at the same time, we see another trend going the other way, which is time that I spend with other people. And I'm going to put a slide of hers into the newsletter because it's so dramatic. And the second presenter at this conference was Dr. Broghammer, and she spoke about this trend that was taking place of loneliness, and she added another possible cause to it. I should say that Dr. Twenge suggested that what happened in 2015 if you haven't already guessed it, is that is when iPhone use or smartphones became ubiquitous among young people, that young people all had iPhones. So with the increase of technology and the iPhone, we see a decrease of hanging out with friends, and we see a dramatic increase in loneliness. In fact, after the panel, one of the young women in the audience who was a student, first-year student at the school, said, you know, I just realized I don't really have any friends that are not online. I don't know who I would call if I actually had to meet with somebody. I got to really think about this. So it was quite apparent this is a crisis. In addition to smartphone use and technology, Dr. Broghammer, the other speaker, had another level to this, and she talked about the tracking with identities. She pointed out in earlier times a young person had multiple identities. You'd be a member of a church, a player on a team, you were from a certain town, you were brother, sister, daughter, parent, daughter to your parents, you know, and your identity was complicated. And she was making a really interesting discussion about how identities have collapsed. White, black, Latino, gay, straight, Republican, Democrat, in very simple categories, and these identities become all-consuming. We say, I'm just this one identity, and it lacks any complexity, but when that identity is under attack, we feel completely under attack. I thought that was another very interesting reason. So we see that. And so social media and identity are both culprits in this crisis. I raised a third possible cause. Particularly as a pastor, I raised the issue that this is really the first generation who doesn't identify with a belief system that there's anything bigger than themselves. I have noticed among young people what I will call nihilism. Nihilism is a belief that life is meaningless. Young people tell me all the time, look, the earth will be gone in 10 years. There's nothing more important in life than what you can touch or measure or feel. There's no soul or heaven or God. And this leads to what I have observed as a WTF attitude. I'll let you figure out what that stands for. But it's sort of, what's the point? Like, what is the point of all this? And that nihilism, that lack of a belief in anything bigger than just yourself to solve everything, means that you have to solve everything. And that's a lot of pressure. And this has created a meaning-making crisis. And I think this meaning-making, making meaning your purpose, why you're here, it's not just about you, there's something bigger than you. And then you add that to social media and technology, and you add that to identity. And I think we're getting to some of the causes of what's taking place in our epidemic of loneliness. This also, I pointed out in my comments, has an impact on politics. And I quoted from Hannah Arendt, who is a famous scholar, and she wrote a book on the origins of totalitarianism. She wrote this book in 1951, but listen to this quote. What prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world is that loneliness, once a borderline experience, usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, is becoming an everyday experience. So she draws a direct line between when you feel lonely, disconnected, anxious, depressed, that it leads you toward a politics that's unhealthy. And I thought that was fascinating. So, lots to be concerned about. Is there anything that we can learn from our faith tradition that could give us some insights into this situation? I think there are. First, I want to highlight that at the very beginning of the Bible, God says in Genesis 2, verse 18, "It is not good that man should be alone. I'll make a helper as a partner." So from the very beginning, God is saying in that story, which is a mythological story of Adam and Eve, it's not a true physical story of Adam and Eve, but saying that God has created us as social beings, that we are required to be living in community. And the truth is, the text of the scripture teaches us that we only grow spiritually through relationships. In other words, there's sometimes the myth that you can go and you can become a more spiritual person by retiring away from everybody else and just living on your own. That is not really backed up in my interpretation of the stories in the Bible. They're all about relationship. That when you engage with other people, that's when you grow. And you can't say you love God if you don't love the person next to you. You have to love others to love God. So meaningful relationships and the relationship with God are critical to avoiding loneliness and despair. In the brief part of the gospel that we read today, Jesus is telling that famous parable where he basically says that God knows all the hairs on your head. Don't worry about tomorrow. God will take great care of you. He cares more, he cares about the birds. He cares more about you. And the more that you place your life into that divine plan that's created for you, the more fulfilling your life will be. So in this model, the goals aren't happiness, which is interesting. In our faith, the goal is not necessarily just happiness. It's about being useful, having an impact. And so he says, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will bring its own worries. Today's trouble is enough for today. And Swedenborg, in his interpretation, tries to address one of the misunderstandings. This does not mean that we should not care about our job or paying our bills or taking care of our family. We should do that, and we should be concerned and worried. That's a very healthy concern to have. It's a responsibility, and it's a good one. However, we need to do all this with God's help and guidance and realize that God is the source of life, and that we need to be engaged with God in those moments and realize that there's a bigger plan. Or if we don't, he argues, we do set ourselves up for loneliness. At one point in today's reading, he describes people who don't think there's any soul. They think that that everything depends on them, and says, anxiety about the future completely consumes them, as does a desire to own everything and dominate everything, a lust that burns and grows bit by bit until it exceeds all bounds. They grieve if they do not achieve their desires and become frantic when deprived of them. So that is the anxiety that happens when we have no cause that's bigger than ourselves, no meaning to our life, but just basically, what are we teaching in our culture? Acquire money, be successful. I've mentioned this before, but when I do ask young people, who are your heroes? Who do you look up to? They mention Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates. And very often they mention people who are very wealthy and have succeeded financially as the goal. And that is definitely not the message from Scripture. That there's, I'm not saying these people don't have a meaning and purpose and you can't and have wealth. I think you can, but that's not the goal. So we always like to have practical solutions in the sermons every week. So what are some practical things we can do in our life to address this in our own personal lives? Well, one is be aware of the phone. And the phone, by the way, is not just a young person's problem. The phone, in an article in the Washington Post, says that boomers can't put their phone down to even pay attention to their grandchildren. So this addiction to technology is not just a millennial issue. It is something that has now gotten to all of us. And the social media companies are preying on us by knowing what we're interested in. And when we're interested for a few seconds, they give us more and more of that. And it's sort of like brainwashing. They get us very drawn into a rabbit hole. So one of the bits of advice from Dr. Twenge was, she just said, make sure you say when you're going to stop looking at the phone, and keep them out of your bedroom, and have a place that's quiet and a sanctuary away from them. And also she mentioned that we really need to get serious about enforcing laws. Technically, children under a certain age, I think it might be 10, are not allowed to go on to the internet. I didn't know that. But anybody who's been on the internet knows that you don't want a 10-year-old seeing what's out there, and they can. So is there ways that we could actually get serious about protecting children's innocence from technology. So I thought that was very practical, some of those solutions. Another thing that we can do in addition to the technological solution is engage in community. So today we're a small group and we are counterculture revolutionaries on this service today. You're engaging in a community right now, and by being here, you're supporting other people, and they're supporting you. And I mentioned at the beginning of our service today the success that Annabelle has had in the work that she's doing, and Katerina in the work that she's doing, and there's a community of people who are excited about it. And I also mentioned that we had a member of our church, recovering from surgery, Ross, last week, and we prayed and we cared about him. That is important work, and don't minimize it. Whatever you decide to do, be in a community. Be in somewhere that people know and care about you. At the conference, one young person did ask, is there any place where the data shows that connection is taking place? And it sounded a little self-serving, but the truth is the answer is churches or faith communities, synagogues, mosques. People who attended church during the pandemic were the only population where mental health increased in their reports. Everything else decreased. So yeah, I believe it's being part of a community where you're talking about things bigger than yourself, and it's giving you complex identities and meaning. Another thing I think is keeping in perspective suffering. Part of the human experience is suffering, and some people wrongly believe that if they have faith, they'll avoid it. That's not true. But we need to become spiritually resilient, and we need to look at challenges in our life as opportunities to grow spiritually, and not as a punishment, and not as something we need to numb ourselves against through drugs or alcohol or going on online rabbit holes. We need to just embrace and grow through them. And there's going to be times in our life when we'll be very confused, and that's okay. That's great, because you are really growing spiritually when you're confused. You're more likely to pray and reach out and grow. So just recognizing that suffering is a part of life, and it's not something we seek, but it'll impact all of us and how we can grow through it. So we are living in a time of great loneliness and anxiety, and to the extent that we can be the solution, we can also be a solution for others who are lonely. One memory I have from those anxious college years that I had, and college years are very anxiety-provoking, was I remember visiting Jim Reap, who I talked about at the beginning, at his nursing home. And I remember visiting him when I was kind of either depressed or sad or, in a bad mood, but I knew I needed to visit him. And what happened when I visited him was I got outside myself. I was listening to his concerns, and it transformed me, and my mood shifted. And when we move into service and curiosity about other people, we can get out of the way of ourselves being the most important thing and the only thing that matters. I was also struck by the comment in the polling survey that said young people said they didn't remember anybody who had taken a few minutes to reach out to them and ask them how they're doing and genuinely cared about it. I think that's a good exercise for all of us this week, to think of someone in our life, particularly a younger person, that we can reach out to and communicate to them that we care about them, how are they doing, and engage in something of a conversation because it's quite lonely out there and it can make a big difference. So that's a very practical thing we can do. Faith communities, we are holding up the light in the darkness right now. It is not a good time for faith communities of growth across the world, but it is very important that we keep doing what we're doing, because we do offer an alternative in a lonely world and an anxious world, that there is a different way. It's not easy, and our offer for community will often be rejected, but if we can stay the course, we can be a community for others in a very lonely world. Amen.